The baby's cry rose thin and piercing through the hush of the river valley, echoing off stone and pine like a prayer too long unanswered. Evening had begun to cool the edges of the land, and the gold light slanting through the trees cast everything in a hushed, dreamlike shade. The wind smelled of water and smoke and the faint sweetness of cottonwood. In the shallows, minnows darted between polished stones, their movements flickering like thoughts too quick to hold. She knelt on the bank, one hand cupped to her child's trembling back, the other trembling as she brushed sweat-dark strands from his brow. He was red-faced, tiny fists curled, mouth wide with grief too big for a body so small. No wound, no fever, no sign of hurt she could soothe, only this cry, ragged and relentless, as though the world itself had failed him and she could not make it right. Her name was Clara, though none had spoken it with tenderness in some time. The baby was Samuel, just Samuel, as if one name might be enough to protect him from all the things that had not spared his father. Behind them, the wagon stood crooked in the dirt, one wheel half buried from when the axle snapped on the rocky descent. The mule had gone lame the night before, and the food was almost gone. But these were facts, not what she felt. What she felt was the ache in her chest from holding too much alone, and the thrum of fear that came with each sunset when she had no firewood left to burn. She meant to follow the trail west till it met with the town folks in Dry Creek. Meant to start again where nobody knew her face or the sins of the man who had once held her too tightly and called it love. But the trail was long and the boy was small, and she was running on borrowed hope. "SHHH now," she whispered, rocking him gently. "Mama's here." The baby screamed harder. And then she heard it, low and quiet, like a song made of river stones and time. It was coming from the trees, a voice, low and weather-worn, weaving through the sobs like thread through frayed cloth. The melody was old, maybe older than the valley, sung in a language no longer taught but felt all the same. It was not joyful nor mournful, but something in between, like a lullaby sung by someone who'd known sorrow long enough to hold it gently. The baby quieted. Clara froze. The hair rose on her arms. The voice kept singing, patient and slow, drawing nearer with each note until it felt like the trees themselves might be humming it. She stood with the boy against her chest, scanning the shadows. Her hand hovered near the knife in her boot, though she hadn't much strength left to wield it. Her eyes caught movement, then a figure, a man. He stepped into the clearing like he'd been part of the land all along. Broad-shouldered, coat worn to threads, a wide-brimmed hat shading half his face. The rest was marked by a scar that ran from his right temple, jagged down to the edge of his jaw, old and puckered, like lightning frozen in flesh. He did not stop singing, just watched her and the boy with a gaze like river rock, not soft but not unkind. Clara didn't speak, didn't move. She felt like a creature caught between the teeth of a trap, unsure whether the pain had already begun or was still coming. When he reached them, he crouched near the fire pit she'd built but never lit, took a knee like it was a ritual, and finished the last note of the song with a breath that stirred the baby's curls. Samuel had gone quiet, not asleep but calm, listening. The man looked up at her. He was crying, he said. His voice was rough, like someone who didn't speak often or not in company. Clara nodded, her voice lost somewhere in the dry hollow of her throat. He didn't rise, just reached into his coat and pulled out a small pouch, unwrapping it with slow hands. Inside were dried berries, strips of meat, something that smelled faintly of mint. "You need food," he said, not as a question, "and he needs rest." Still, she said nothing. She couldn't trust him, but something in her, some ancient thread of instinct older than fear, kept her from running. The man looked at her again, longer this time. "Name's Elias." Clara didn't answer. He nodded like he understood that too, and laid the food carefully beside her feet. Then he rose, not with haste, but with the grace of someone used to moving quiet through wild places. He turned back toward the trees. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice barely louder than the river. He paused. "Nowhere far, camp's near. If you need more help, come find me before night falls." Then he was gone, the trees swallowing him like he'd never been there at all. Samuel sighed softly against her chest. Clara looked down at the boy, then at the food, then at the trees where the song had come from. The river kept on running, and the wind whispered through the cottonwoods. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a fire cracked to life. And for the first time in weeks, Clara did not feel entirely alone. Night took its time settling over the valley. The sky deepened to a color between bruise and ink, stars beginning to blink awake like shy witnesses. Clara stayed where she was for a long while after Elias disappeared, her fingers absently tracing the curve of Samuel's spine, feeling the slow rise and fall of his breath. When at last she moved, it was with the caution of someone unlearning fear. She laid the baby down inside the wagon, nestling him among blankets and the worn muslin shawl that had once belonged to her sister. He stirred but didn't wake. His little hand clutched the fabric like it knew something she didn't. She took the food Elias had left, chewed a strip of meat, tart with juniper, and then a berry that burst bittersweet on her tongue. Enough to take the edge off the hunger gnawing at her belly, but not enough to forget it altogether. The fire she lit was small, just a curl of flame cradled in stones, fed with pine needles and broken twigs. Light flickered on the wagon's side, painting her shadow tall and lean. She sat close but not too close, hands wrapped around her knees, listening. No more song came from the woods, just the usual chorus of dusk, frogs calling out for rain, owls staking their dominion, the brush of wind through undergrowth. The river whispered, tireless as ever. Clara hadn't planned to sleep, but the fatigue was a weight she could no longer refuse. She woke hours later to a distant yip, coyote likely, too far to be a threat but near enough to quicken her heart. She checked Samuel first. Still sleeping, still breathing, his mouth slack with peace she hadn't seen in days. She stepped beyond the firelight. The trees were hushed and vast, and each step forward felt like slipping deeper into another world. The moon rode high, silvering everything it touched, making the leaves glow like frost. Her boots barely crunched the earth. She didn't know what she was doing, only that something inside her moved like a tide drawn toward whatever lived in the hush between the trees. She found his camp without meaning to. Elias sat on a fallen log, sharpening a blade with a slow, steady rhythm. His fire was banked low, coals glowing like the heart of a story still untold. A battered tin pot sat on a rock beside it, steam curling up from within. The scent of it, rosemary, maybe, and bone, reached her before he did. He didn't look surprised when she appeared, just nodded once and said, "You walk quiet." She didn't respond. She stood at the edge of the clearing, arms crossed, unsure if she was trespassing or invited. "You hungry?" "I already ate." He nodded again, like that settled something. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It had weight, yes, but not burden. More like the stillness of a chapel or the space between two breaths before something important is said. "You fix the axle?" he asked after a while. "No tools, no help. That's not a job for one person." "Then you'll be here a while." She didn't answer, but they both knew it was true. He set the blade down and poured something from the pot into a battered tin cup, held it out to her. She stepped forward, took it, sat on a flat stone across from him. The drink was warm, spiced, unfamiliar but good. She sipped and watched him from over the rim. "You always sing like that?" she asked finally. "Only when there's something needs hearing." "And you thought my boy needed hearing?" He was hollering like the earth was splitting. Figured I'd lend him a little peace. Clara looked into the fire. "Where'd you learn it?" Elias didn't speak right away. The fire cracked once like a warning not to press. "Old place, long way from here. Folks who knew the land better than most. They sang to the wind, to the dead, to the soil. I just remember a piece." She nodded slowly. That made sense somehow, more sense than most things lately. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. He looked at her then, not just at her face, but all of her, the wear in her shoulders, the tension that lived beneath her skin, the places where grief had set down roots. "You running?" he asked. She flinched. "Not my business," he said. "Only asked 'cause I know the look, woman carrying more than her share." She set the cup down. "Don't matter where I came from, just where I'm trying to go." "And where, that?" "Anywhere he can grow up without learning to fear a man's voice." Elias said nothing, but his jaw worked slightly. He stared into the fire like it might answer questions he didn't know how to ask. "You want help fixing that wagon?" he said. "I'll lend a hand in the morning." Clara didn't thank him, just stood, nodded once, and turned back toward her camp. The woods didn't feel so wide on the walk back. Samuel stirred when she returned, eyes blinking open in the dark. She lifted him gently, cradled him against her chest, and whispered the only line of Elia's song she could remember. The boy stilled, and as the firelight died down, Clara watched the trees for a long time, the shadow of a scarred man lingering just behind her thoughts. The morning came slow and pale, spilling light over the valley like milk. Mist clung to the underbrush, low and patient, while the river moved with its usual quiet insistence. Birds called from the canopy, sharp and sudden, then stilled again as if listening for something more ancient. Clara awoke to the sound of footsteps. She sat up, hand instinctively reaching toward the knife beneath her blanket, heart already hammering before her eyes had cleared. But it was Elia's. He was carrying an axe over one shoulder, a coil of rope looped around the other. His coat was slung open, revealing the layered tatters of his shirt, and his eyes swept the camp like a man who knew how quickly things could turn. "Mornin'," he said. Clara stood, brushing sleep from her dress. Samuel, still asleep in the wagon, was curled against the shawl like a creature tucked into its den. The sight of him so at ease gave her the strength to nod. "Mornin'." Elias crouched beside the wagon, fingers tracing the broken axle. He pressed into the wood with a quiet frown. "This'll take some work," he muttered. "Tree'll need felling, you got nails." She shook her head. "I've got some, not many, but enough." "You came prepared for everything, didn't you?" "Don't believe in being caught unready." They spent the day working, though Clara didn't think of it that way. It wasn't labor in the usual sense, no urgency, no barked commands, no expectation that she move faster or speak less. Elias worked like he was part of the land itself, cutting only what he needed, shaping the timber with care instead of haste. Clara watched his hands more than his face, hands that bore calluses, scars, and a strange gentleness that seemed to speak another language entirely. She fetched water, gathered smaller wood, held things steady when asked. They spoke little. Words weren't necessary when the work itself told the story. The boy watched from the wagon, eyes following every movement, occasionally letting out a soft coo as if encouraging them. By late afternoon, the new axle was fitted. Elias wiped sweat from his brow and stood back to admire the work. The scar on his face caught the sun, a pale ridge like bone beneath skin. "That'll hold," he said. Clara stepped beside him, arms crossed. "You do this often." "No, but I've had reason to learn." She didn't ask what reason. She was beginning to understand that silence in Elias was not the absence of memory, it was the weight of it. The air grew heavier as the sun dipped. A storm was coming. Clara could feel it in her joints, in the way the birds fell quiet and the wind changed direction. "You got shelter?" she asked. Elias nodded. "Cave up north, dry if it don't flood." "You should go." He looked at her, long and steady. "And leave you two in this." She met his gaze. "We'll be all right." But even as she said it, thunder rumbled far off, deep enough to stir the river's surface. "You got canvas for cover?" "No." "Then you won't be." She opened her mouth to argue, but stopped. Elias turned toward the trees. "Grab what you can carry, we'll go now." She hesitated, not because she didn't trust him, though trust was still a fragile thing, but because of what it meant to follow. To leave her wagon, her few worldly goods, her illusion of self-reliance. But Samuel cried once, a soft whimper of unease, and that settled it. She packed quickly, just what she needed: blankets, food, a tin cup, the shawl. She strapped Samuel to her chest with a strip of cloth, tucked his feet close. He stared at Elias with solemn eyes. They moved fast. The trail wound uphill, roots slick underfoot, the sky dimming with every step. Rain began to fall in fat drops, scattered at first, then relentless. It slicked Clara's hair to her scalp, soaked her dress, made her teeth chatter. But Elias kept moving, his stride unbroken, pausing only to check that she was still behind him. The cave was small, set into the hillside like a mouth mid-breath. Elias had cleared it earlier. She saw the signs now, the fire circle, the stacked wood kept dry beneath a shelf of stone. They ducked inside just as the storm broke open in earnest, lightning stitching the sky together in jagged bursts. Inside, the cave was cool and dry. The walls breathed damp earth and old ash. Clara sat against the wall, Samuel nestled against her, his face tucked into her collarbone. Elias knelt to build the fire. When the flame caught, it was a living thing, warmth blooming outward, shadows leaping. Clara's fingers trembled as she unwrapped the baby and laid him close to the fire. His skin was clammy. She held him tighter, rubbed his limbs, whispered nonsense just to hear something human in the dark. Elias passed her a blanket without a word, then another for the baby. She took them, nodded. When Samuel finally sighed and stilled, Clara turned to Elias. He was sitting with his back to the stone, legs stretched out, one hand resting on the hilt of a long knife. His eyes were on the fire, but his mind was somewhere else. "Why'd you help us?" she asked. He didn't look at her, didn't see no one else who would. "That's not an answer. I don't owe you one." She stiffened. Then he added, quieter, "But maybe I owe someone." Clara watched him a while longer, the firelight catching in his eyes. They were the color of old whiskey, dulled by time and smoke. "Who?" she asked. He didn't speak. But his face softened, just for a moment, and Clara thought she saw a ghost there. Not the kind that haunts, but the kind a man carries because he can't bear to forget. Samuel stirred again, reaching out with one tiny hand. Clara caught it, cradled it against her cheek. Elias sang then, soft and slow, the same melody from the river. This time Clara listened closer, not just to the tune, but the shape of it, the way it seemed to say things no words ever could. Samuel fell asleep to that song. Clara, too, found herself breathing deeper. The storm raged outside, wild and unrelenting, but within the cave the fire burned on. And in that small, flickering circle of warmth, something wordless began to grow. By morning the storm had passed, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and glistening. Rainwater clung to the trees like pearls, and the air tasted of pine and stone. Insects buzzed low to the ground, stirred to life by the warmth seeping back into the soil. Clara stepped out of the cave with Samuel bundled against her. Her boots sank into the soft loam, and steam rose where sunlight met damp earth. She walked to the edge of a small ridge and looked down toward the river. It ran full now, louder than before, its surface quickened by runoff. The wagon was still there, dark with rain, wheels sunken deeper. But it was whole. The work Elias had done had held. Behind her, he emerged without sound. He moved like a shadow in daylight, present but not demanding space. "I'll walk with you," he said. Clara nodded. She didn't ask why anymore. They followed a deer trail that bent along the ridge and dipped through brush slick with rain. Elias cut away branches where the storm had left them tangled. At one point, Clara paused to retie the cloth holding Samuel. Elias reached to help, his hands careful, never touching more than he needed to. She let him. For a moment, their fingers brushed, and the warmth of it lingered. At the wagon, Clara checked the supplies, what little hadn't been ruined by the downpour. Most things were damp but usable. The bedding needed sun. The flour had gone to paste. "Food's low," she murmured. Elias crouched beside a stone, picked up a wet boot, shook it out. "I'll hunt." She turned to him. "You don't have to." "I know." He left without ceremony, disappearing into the woods with a bow slung across his back, and a quietness that seemed older than the land itself. Clara spent the day cleaning. She dried what she could, set Samuel in the shade with a ring of stones so he couldn't roll, and patched a tear in her dress. She didn't think about where Elias was or when he might return, but part of her kept listening anyway. By dusk he came back with a rabbit and wild onions wrapped in a strip of cloth. His face was scratched, his coat flecked with bramble, but he smiled, barely, as he handed her the food. They cooked over a fresh fire. Clara watched the flames curl around the meat, the scent thick and good in her nose. She handed Samuel to Elias once, only to stoke the coals, and was surprised when the man held the child as though he'd done it before. Not awkward, not distant, just still as if his whole body listened. "He likes you," she said. Elias looked down at the boy, whose tiny hand now gripped a fold of his shirt. "Don't know why." "Babies know things," Clara said. "They know what's safe." He didn't reply, but he didn't hand the child back right away, either. That night they didn't return to the cave. The sky was clear, the stars laid out wide like stories untold. Clara slept near the fire, Samuel curled close. Elias lay not far off, wrapped in his coat, his face turned to the sky. In the quiet, Clara listened to the way his breathing shifted, how it deepened, softened. She realized she trusted it now, the sound of him there. Not because he had protected them, though he had, or because he could provide, though he did. It was the silence between them, how it never felt empty. Days passed. They didn't speak of where they were headed. Clara stopped thinking in terms of miles or destinations. Each morning she checked the wagon, fed the boy, tended to small chores. Elias came and went, always returning with something, food, firewood, once even a bundle of cloth for Samuel made from an old shirt. She began to notice things. The way Elias' scar tugged when he smiled, how he never sat with his back to open ground, how his hands shook a little when he first rose after sleep. Wounds don't always bleed, she knew. Some of them lived under the skin, always waking. One afternoon, as the baby slept and the sun hung low, Clara asked, "You got someone waiting on you?" Elias sat sharpening a stone. He paused. "Not anymore." "What happened?" His jaw tensed. "She was like you, brave, tired, didn't run when she should have." Clara said nothing. The weight of it settled between them. "She died in a house made of fire," he said at last, "because I believed a man's promise who'd already broken everyone he ever made." Clara turned to him. "You tried to save her." "I tried, I was too late." She stood then, walked to where he sat. She knelt beside him and laid a hand on his. It was not affection, not comfort, just the quiet offering of presence. "I buried someone once too," she said. "Someone I should have left before the grave ever opened." They didn't speak after that, but something shifted, not spoken, not sudden, just a slow turning, like a wheel in mud finally finding the path. That night Samuel woke with a cry, a fever, sudden and mean. Clara held him close, rocked him, tried to remember old remedies. Elias brought her water, laid cool cloth to the baby's head. His hands were steady, his voice low. He sang again. This time Clara joined him. Her voice cracked, barely there, but it braided into his like threads long separated, finding one another again. The baby stilled, sweat cooling on his brow. His breathing eased. Clara looked at Elias through the firelight, and for the first time she let herself wonder what it might mean, not to belong to someone but to walk beside them, not to be saved but to be seen. The song faded, the river whispered. The scar on Elias' face caught the firelight, and for a moment it did not look like a wound. It looked like a map. In the days that followed, something unspoken bloomed between them, tentative as spring grass pushing through frost. It didn't have a name. It wasn't built on declarations or promises. It was shaped in the small, steady rhythm of shared living. Elias carved spoons from driftwood. Clara mended clothes with bits of colored thread. They taught Samuel to laugh. Not all was easy. The weather shifted fast in the high country, and some nights were too cold, the fire too small. Once, Clara spilled what little coffee remained, and she sat by the wagon wheel and cried without sound. Elias handed her a cup of river water and didn't look away. That mattered more than any comfort. One morning, as light broke gold across the valley, Elias left without a word. He often went off to hunt or scout, but this time he was gone longer than usual. Hours passed, then a full day. The second night came with no sign of him. Clara didn't panic, not at first. She kept a routine, gathered berries, fed Samuel, watched the trees. But as dusk came down and Elias still hadn't returned, a tightness coiled in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with what she hadn't wanted to admit. She missed him. By the third morning, worry grew into something heavier. She wrapped Samuel close and followed the trail Elias had taken, moving slow but certain through the woods. Birds scattered ahead of her. The river murmured on, indifferent. She found him miles upstream. He was kneeling by the body of a young deer, his knife still in hand. Blood stained the ground, bright and cruel, but Elias wasn't moving. He was staring at the trees like they'd turned against him. Clara stepped closer. Elias. He didn't flinch. "I called your name," she said. He looked up slowly. His face was drawn, paler than she'd ever seen it. "I heard you." "What happened?" He stood stiff, like his bones didn't belong to him anymore. "I shot too soon, Didn't wait. It ran. When I caught it, it was already dying hard. She looked at the deer. Its breath had stilled, its eyes glassy. You did what you had to. Elias shook his head. I know what death looks like. That wasn't mercy. That was a mistake. Clara reached out, touched his arm. You came back, that's what matters. He looked down at her hand on his coat. I thought about not. The words hung in the air, cold, naked. But you did, she said softly. I don't know why. I do. He looked at her then, and in that gaze was something raw, hope maybe, or shame pretending not to be fear. Clara stepped closer, Samuel shifting against her chest. The child reached toward Elias, as if remembering him even through silence. You're allowed to stay, she said. Elias swallowed hard. I've never known how. Then learn here. The wind stirred around them, lifting the edges of Clara's dress. The boy let out a small sound, half question, half comfort. They buried the deer together, not because they had to, but because it felt right. Elias whispered something low as the dirt covered the body. A farewell, maybe, a forgiveness. Back at camp, he built the fire higher than usual. Clara watched him move, slower now, more deliberate. When he sat beside her, there was no space between them. That night they shared a meal in silence. Samuel slept in the crook of her arm, and Elias sat close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, even without touch. Do you ever dream? She asked. Elias stared into the flames, not for a long time. I do, sometimes, of a house near water, with a garden and smoke from the chimney. It's quiet there. No one's chasing me. He didn't respond at first. Then softly, I see a ridge, wind through dry grass, a boy running ahead of me calling my name. Clara turned to him. Is he yours? Elias nodded, just once. Where is he now? Gone, long time now. The fire cracked. Samuel stirred. Elias glanced at the boy. He looks like him, sometimes. I'm sorry, she whispered. So am I. She reached for his hand, this time without hesitation. He let her take it. I don't have a house, she said, but I have this boy, and I think maybe I could have a garden someday. He didn't speak, but his hand tightened around hers. Later, when they lay on their backs beneath the stars, Samuel between them, Elias said, You think there's a place for people like us? Clara watched the sky, wide and glimmering, not waiting, but maybe one we can build. He didn't answer, but he didn't let go of her hand either. And for the first time in many, many years, neither of them felt like they were running. They left the valley when the cottonwoods turned yellow, when the mornings came cold and thin, and the river slowed to a hush beneath frost. Clara wrapped Samuel tight in a quilt stitched from scraps, and Elias loaded what little they had into the wagon, his movements steady, practiced. No ceremony marked their departure. Only the soft sound of hooves over damp earth and the creak of wood settling under weight. Clara sat beside Elias on the bench. Samuel, tucked between them, watched the trees pass with wide eyes. They didn't look back. The trail led west, winding through pine and alder, then out into country that opened up like a held breath. Hills rolled low beneath a wide sky. Sometimes they passed other travelers, trappers, a preacher with a mule-drawn cart, a woman with 3 children and no husband in sight. They never lingered, just nodded, tipped hats, moved on. At night, Elias sang, always the same song, always for Samuel. The boy would quiet, turn his face toward that scarred man's voice as if drawn by something older than memory. Clara listened, too, the sound working its way beneath her ribs like roots into soil. They found the town at the edge of the high plain. It wasn't much, 6 buildings huddled near a grain silo, a lopsided church, a fence missing more slats than it held. But there was water, a field lying fallow, a schoolhouse where children laughed in the distance. They stopped. The wagon leaned tired against the post behind the general store. Samuel was asleep in Elias' arms, and Clara stood looking out at the empty lot across the road. She could almost see it. A house with a low roof, smoke curling from a stone chimney, rows of potatoes in neat furrows. A place where the wind didn't sound like warning. You sure? Elias asked. No, she smiled, soft, but I'm not afraid. He looked at her for a long while, then said, I'll build it. What? The house, if we're staying, I'll build it. She didn't answer right away, just stepped closer, touched the scar on his face with her fingertips. What if I want to help? He smiled, crooked and unsure. Then I reckon we'll build it together. Weeks passed. They bartered for tools, shared stew with the preacher's wife, traded hours of labor for seed and nails. Elias worked the land by hand, shoulder to soil, while Clara mended walls, cleaned out the root cellar, taught Samuel to walk barefoot through rows of grass. He laughed now, real, belly-deep laughs that rang across the yard like bells. When he fell, Elias was the first to reach him, lifting him slow, speaking in that low voice only the boy seemed to understand. The house rose board by board, small but solid, one room for now. A bed of straw, patched windows, a door that stuck in the frame. But each thing in it had been placed with care, like building a life not of perfection but of presence. One morning snow came early, just a dusting enough to hush the world and set everything sparkling. Clara stood in the doorway, Samuel on her hip watching Elias chop wood by the oak tree. His coat flapped open, his breath fogged the air. He glanced up and smiled at her, not wide, just enough. She raised her hand in return, palm open, the way people do when words are not needed. That night after Samuel was asleep and the fire burned low, Clara said, "Do you still think about them, the ones you lost?" Elias sat beside her, back to the wall, his hands rough with the day's work. "Every night." "Me too." He turned to her, "But I don't just think about them anymore." She didn't ask what else he thought of, she knew. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. They sat that way for a long time, the fire catching gold in their hair, in the boy's sleeping face. Outside, wind moved gently through the trees. The roof above them groaned in the cold but held, and somewhere in the dark, a river still ran, a song still lingered. This wasn't a story of rescue. It was one of staying, of building slowly from the rubble of what had been broken. Of a child who cried by the river, and a man with a scar who stayed long enough to sing him home.